Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Rejoice, for joining us for this session, which is just dedicated to raising awareness about the need to end impunity for crimes and acts of violence against journalists. And,
right.
I think it's particularly an important day in terms of promoting a safe and enabling environment for journalists to be able to carry out their work without any fear. And yeah, we've seen around the world cases of journalists. I think in the most extreme cases being killed. A lot of threats, harassments, physical violence. And even murder. And today we are hoping that maybe we can get an understanding of really what the situation is in Africa, and maybe some ways in which we can contribute, to advocating for and trying to create a better working environment for journalists. And yeah, maybe we can start maybe by you pointing out, what you feel, or rather what the situation is in Africa in terms of safety, and the freedom of journalists being able to do their work.
Well, look, I mean, it's important to point out at the outset, the very, very outset, that freedom of information and media and journalists is part of this quarter of human rights. It's not a favor to any government to have a media operating or a journalist report. It is not a favor. It is a human right. This is why even Antonio Guterres always stresses on the World Media Press Day that the freedom of press is the foundation of democracy and justice. Where there is no democracy, there can never be justice. And where the media is thwarted and dwarfed, there can never be democracy and justice. It is an illusion, even in so-called benevolent democracies like Rwanda. It is an illusion that a government can be good but vindictive on journalists. It's basically an oxymoron, because a free human being, especially in a liberal democratic environment, a free human being should have access to information, because it is information that builds countries and communities, that enlightens. We can never be civilized if we don't have information. So whether information is formal, as in academic or research information, or whether it is historical, stashed in some government archives, or it is news and views and opinions, it is almost impossible. Because in 1945, during the time of the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the issue of freedom of information was stressed. Shall I also say that, unfortunately, that was just about the time that the state of Israel was also formed, and we know what it is now. But we are going to get to that. So had it been that we don't have dictatorships and authoritarian regimes and governments that don't understand constitutionalism, and we wouldn't even have commemorations of World Freedom Day. It wouldn't be necessary. In Africa, we have almost like 10 to 15 institutions that were set up solely to pursue the interest and the protection and the security and the safety of journalists. It is only done because we know that there are African countries that go out of their way to infringe on the rights of the journalists. Not just governments, unfortunately, even private sector institutions, media organizations that benefit from slave labor from journalists. It is incredibly difficult to survive as a journalist in Africa because media organizations don't respect, they don't value the quality of the work that we do. So this is why governments have a field day in abusing journalists, because they know that we are not confident enough to look after ourselves. We survive on bribes, on khaki envelopes, on benevolence, and we survive on sympathy. And that is not right. Journalism is a profession. We must be respected and remunerated and paid as much as any other professional, because without information, there is no development. So in a bit, we will talk about it as we go, but even the Africa Unity, the regional organizations like ECOWAS, IGAD, SADC, they have strong protocols that protect the independence and the safety of journalism. But the behavior of governments is generally opposed to those protocols. Obvious reason that our levels of democracy in Africa are different. So it's these different levels of understanding what democracy is that causes problems for journalists. And we keep emphasizing that it does not matter how authoritarian a regime is, the freedom and the safety and the security of the journalist, especially the investigative journalist, must be guarded with the jealousy it demands.
Yeah, right. And yeah, maybe before we go on with the discussion, these are International Day to End Impunity for Crimes against journalists. It's really, we are commemorating it as an initiative of the United Nations. Do you, as a journalist yourself, as someone who's doing work in this capacity of making sure that the public has access to the right information, do you feel that the UN really has done enough in terms of trying to actually, enhance accountability and to make sure, maybe, for example, people who interfere with the rights of journalists are prosecuted and so on?
No, of course not. I mean, the UN is a body of different sovereign states,
right,
who come to the table with different political interests. I can tell you that Eritrea, Somalia, Zimbabwe, Swaziland, Rwanda, Israel, Sudan are members of the United Nations. So, but you'll find that there's so much impunity that goes unpunished in these so-called UN member states. So it means that the United Nations can have the capacity to produce fancy resolutions around the freedom of the journalists, and put statutory obligations on states to make sure that the impunity against journalists is reduced. But they don't have the institutional capacity to enforce these things. Because if it is an issue of conflict, of military conflict, they can be able to send an army, a UNICEF, a United Nations force, and all. But I still do believe that countries that violate the rights of journalists, that exercise, media with impunity, must be sanctioned like any other country. They must be sanctioned, because the United Nations is an institution that survives on information. And so if investigative journalism, if impunity against investigative journalism is not punished, so what is the point? If the Israeli government can shoot journalists at will,
can you hear me, Rejoice? All right, we seem to have lost Rejoice there. I hope he's going to be joining us back. And yeah, so thank you guys for having joined that for us for this session. Yeah, we are looking at, there has been so many cases. Oh yeah, I think Rejoice is back. You may continue, sir.
Yeah. No, I was just, I said most of the thing, but I was saying that without resolutions that punish and sanction, countries that treat journalists with disrespect, there is no point in having those resolutions. So the United Nations the regional bodies, the local, bodies, the human rights entities in countries are not doing enough. So this is why countries act with impunity, knowing that there is no punishment that is going to come their way anytime soon. And it is very, very unfortunate that even countries that have veto power, like the United States of America, China, Russia, France, England, there are cases of abuse of journalists in those countries, but there are no resolutions against it. It is a sad thing, it's tragic, and I think that other than just commemorating these sort of days, we should be creating new angles of sanctioning and accountability that bring this thing to the fore. It is unacceptable that in the 21st century, a journalist putting on a press, a beep can be shot at. It is unacceptable. It is unacceptable that a journalist who is reporting on corruption in Swaziland and Zimbabwe is arrested and jailed. It is unacceptable in the 21st century. And such countries must be sanctioned without any shame. They must be brought to book and they must be made accountable. Hundreds of cases, thousands of cases of journalists that have been murdered and abused have not been brought to court. It is tragic. That is the problem that I think as journalists we should be pushing for this kind of strong resolution and sanctioning for these rogue countries.
Yeah, on that particular point in terms of sanctioning, we've seen a lot of that. We've seen a lot of that, not only when it comes to other kinds of human rights violations, but to what extent, do we expect these sanctions to work? And aren't we also looking at the same case where they apply to particular nations that can be are not that powerful, that essentially can be bullied? We've seen maybe in the case of the G8 and so on, we might not be having some of these sanctions, applying in their case, or rather being effective. What a different proposal, rather, would you have? Just to make sure that in as much as we are proposing to have these sanctions and so on, they are going to be implemented, they are going to be effective, and they are going to apply to most of these wealthy countries, because we've seen what has been happening, and especially with countries around the Gulf.
I mean, this is terribly simple. The international communication system is intertwined, So there's no country that can claim to have independent international, independent information systems. Even China, for all it cares, if it doesn't have links with the global trade, with the global marketing and value chain, there's nothing that can happen in China. And the good thing is that these systems are not controlled by by government. They are controlled by private internet service providers like Google, like the Elon Musk's things. Facebook is also controlled by Meta. So if this sanctioning system is linked to those kind of institutions, if, for instance, there is over violation of journalistic rights, say in Swaziland or in Zimbabwe, these international companies can just simply say to these governments, "We're going to switch you off. We don't care. We're just going to switch you off from the global information, a highway." It's very simple. So it is important for these private companies that offer information systems and underwater communication lines to be able to subscribe to these principles, so that they can use their power, their financial and technological power, to switch off and sanction these countries that are misbehaving, that are acting with impunity against journalists. So there's hope. It is possible.
Yes, and I think I'll agree with you on that particular point, because, for example, in the case of Elon Musk, I think we saw during, when war broke out between Russia and Ukraine. You know, I believe we saw his stand in terms of deploying his Starlink.
Right.
The satellite, what do I call it, facility or so on, you know, to be able to actually relay information to enable communications. And some of these organizations are pretty big, way bigger than most countries on.
Absolutely. And,
Yes.
and the government can also suffer because it's not only journalists and the private sector that benefits from this information superhighway.
Right.
Also governments, they benefit because multilateral trade, bilateral trade, foreign affairs, military systems all operate on this huge, massive global information highway. So if these Starlink companies, these Googles of the world, the Meta of the world, and say the minute you start stifling information and abusing journalists, we just switch you off. It's just that simple, really. So I think it's another side because the United Nations cannot act on its own.
Right.
They can only trumpet the principles and the values of respecting and minimizing impunity against journalism, but they can't enforce. So there's somebody out there on this planet who can switch off the system and say, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, DRC, Israel, you are misbehaving. We're switching you off of satellite system. You're going to see a big change. It's time to move around that perception because we are tired of a continuous abuse of journalists. The impunity apparently seems to be increasing. And countries, authoritarian regimes and juntas in Africa are getting away with it. What is the AU? What is an AU meeting without journalists? And if the International Journalists Union say, your member states are abusing our journalists, so we are not going to cover that meeting. We are going to tell our members in Africa not to cover that AU. We are going to appeal to Starlink, to Meta to switch you off, guys. You switch off your system. We are going to ask Microsoft to switch off their systems. I mean, it works, So this is why I'm saying I'm glad that you invited me because this is a new angle of attack so that we protect this very noble profession of journalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's another point I agree with you in terms of, media houses for example, even if it's within the context of a country and journalists out there, they're on a campaign trail, they're trying to push a particular policy and so on and so on. They will always depend on journalists, to be there to cover it and relay that particular piece of information to the rest of the public. And they do have the power to say that you are abusing our rights. We are not going to be able to dedicate our resources to cover your particular events. But this would be my question, though. There are business interests. What is the possibility of maybe these media houses? Because we've seen it, for example, in the context of my country, Kenya. You will always have a media house, that remains stuck with the government, even when the rest of the media houses are going the other way. Because we've seen it happen in this country, and especially during when administrations are changing and so on. So what do you imagine that there would be a particular time when all the media houses would come to the table, chart a common cause and to be able to put these business interests and profitability ahead of the rights of the journalists who are really most of the time their employees?
No, look, I mean, it's in a democracy. In a democracy, every journalist and every media house is allowed to have its own ideology and political leaning. That is part of life. But whether or not an institution, even if the Standard or the Daily Nation is pro-government, it does not matter. The important thing is to distill the rights of the journalists to the bare minimum. That everybody who qualifies to be a journalist who's got a press card, whether they are working for pro-government media or they're waiting for KTV or a private station or whoever, whether they are Chama cha Mapinduzi, ZANU-PF, or Democratic Alliance, it does not matter. What matters is their interest must be protected, because we want to differentiate between journalists and media houses.
Right.
That differentiation is very important, because as long as you're a journalist, you are expected to be professional.
Yeah.
So whether is politically you support Chama cha Mapinduzi or somebody supports the other party, it does not matter, as long as you remain professional, because your interests are collective, in the sense that all journalists work within a certain, global or universal protocol. So you must all be protected. So these institutions I've been telling you about, the ICGU, the ICJ, the whatever, Article 19, they are only interested in the interest of the journalist. Media houses, yeah, it's okay, because media houses have got the capacity, financial and economic capacity, to protect their interests. It is business. If a media house decides to be pro-government, it's their choice. But we are saying whichever journalist is working within that environment, their interest must be protected. They must be safe. They must not be abused. They must be, compensated fairly. They must not be dispatched to dangerous assignments, like where there are, terrorist activities, like Somalia, against their will. So our interests as journalists can be distilled and aggregated to be generic and universal. That is the point that I want to make.
Yes, and I do agree with you and on that particular point, and I think it's still, in as much as even the journalists, the media houses will never be on the same side. I think it is good to set that precedent in terms of that particular media house, that particular organization, that defends the rights of the journalists at a particular time said no. To people really who do not want to respect their rights as human, as professionals, and generally as journalists. But moving on, really, I'm interested. Are there particular countries in Africa, or maybe even globally, that we may say that they are doing better in terms of protecting the rights of journalists, and are there particular models, and policies, that they are implementing that you can be looking at, implementing in the African, our own local context here?
You ask a very good question, because there is a correlation between the level and the quality of democracy in a country and the nature of the treatment of journalists. These things are intertwined. There is asymmetry. Obviously, in a dictatorial autocratic regime like Swaziland or Zimbabwe or Rwanda, you will find that the level of impunity against journalists and media houses is much higher. But I'll tell you what, in one of his speeches lately in South Africa, President Ramaphosa said, I want to quote him and say, quote, Africa is not the march to entrench a culture of human rights. The culture of democracy, gender equality, inclusion, peace, prosperity, security for all citizens, and unfettered media freedom and independence. Now, this kind of statement, or close quote, can hardly be said by a country whose constitutional provisions and order does not respect media independence. So you find that in countries like South Africa, to a certain extent, Kenya, and of course, Nigeria, there is a strong sense and a feeling that journalists and the media are given free play, because there's a very high culture of democratization. When journalists are being abused, they are being abused by paid mercenaries that are paid by government. to try and intimidate them. But if you look at the press in South Africa, it's one of the freest presses in the world. So this is why Ramaphosa can afford to even claim that there is an increasing culture of democratization and human rights in Africa, which I don't quite agree with him. But he's saying it because on the basis of empirical evidence that in his country, you can have SABC, a South African Broadcasting Corporation television and radio station, being government owned by but treating itself like a public independent institution. It's unheard of in Africa.
Yeah.
If you are listening to SABC TV and you are listening to ETV or to another private television station, you can't tell the difference. They have got, the journalists have access to whatever information is necessary when there are public events and government events. They can report on it. They have access to parliamentary procedures. So to me, that is a very good model. First of all, start with the Constitution. Make sure that the Constitution is foolproof. It is unequivocal and strong and straight in its provision that all journalists must be treated with the dignity they deserve because it is a human right. And then after that, also an unequivocal constitution that says, the media houses, there must be a law that protects the independence and the safety of journalists. So the constitutional provisions in South Africa are followed by what? By a law. And once that law has been put in place, then the clauses that talk about freedom of association are also unequivocal, say all journalists are free to be members of any institution they want, so that they can coagulate around unions, around guild clubs, around anything. Then they can share their experiences freely and protect their rights. And above all, every journalist should be given a press card and be allowed to access any place. So you can see that South Africans can boast to a certain extent to have that. So the quick test for freedom and safety of journalists is through looking at how government treats its media houses. Does it treat the public houses, media houses, equally as they treat also the private media houses? So South Africa is a very, very good model of how journalists should be treated.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I do agree that certainly of course there has been those steps that have been made, because even when I was growing up during Moi's time and
right.
the current times, back then we had I think access mostly to the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation, KBC, and you can
KBC, yeah.
Today you can always tell the difference in terms of the news coverage, in terms of the depth, in terms of the things that they are willing and free to say on air, most of which could really not make it to prime news time back in the day. And yeah, I do agree that we've certainly made some progress, and I hope that this is something that we can keep on doing, because information, clear information, the correct information, factual, is really important.
Absolutely.
For citizens to be able to make whatever decisions they want to make, because whatever is being influenced is being communicated will even influence how we end up voting. And before we get really into what we can do, what governments can do, and these journalists organization can be able to do to further protect journalists. Really, I wanna get an opinion from you in terms of social media. We've seen what social media has come up to some extent, right. Be able to cover to cover events to some extent. And of course, we've seen what social media has done. For example, a few days ago, I remember watching a video of Kenyan citizens, recording and posting a police officer who was harassing a journalist from covering I remember it was an accident or something like that. And yeah, that is a good step in protecting journalists and so on. But at the same time, everyone thinks they are journalists because they can record something, say, share it on social media. Do you feel that this particular thing, is watering down the importance of journalists, and that can contribute, further to this impunity that we are talking about in terms of, treading on what's supposed to be their rights as professionals and as humans?
Well, look, I mean, civilization, industrialization and civilization is a double-edged sword.
Right.
If you're going to have an aeroplane that travels at 2,000 kilometers per hour, it means that if there is a problem, it's going to be difficult to solve the problem. So it is a fact of life that, the social media has brought new opportunities for journalists and new threats for journalists.
Right.
Threats in the sense that citizen journalism is now so widespread that it will take a couple of seconds for a person passing through Jomo Kenyatta International Airport to know that there is a problem and post it.
Yeah.
And say there's a corrupt officer at JK. You know what I mean? Whereas during the days of Moi, that would take about 2 months to get out into the media.
Right.
So the issue is twofolded now. First of all, as journalists, we need to sharpen our professionalism. Our fact-checking system has to be very, very fast, so that even if we are slightly delayed in terms of passing information, it should be factual, it should be in depth, it should be accurate, and should be up to date, which is what a citizen journalist cannot do.
Right.
Right. So there's a difference between populism and journalism. So which means that the institutions that we create for ourselves for self-regulation, we should start studying ways of ensuring that we are always ahead of the citizen journalist in terms of our professionalism, in terms of our approach, our style, and our accuracy. But we should also learn to be fast now. We should always be fast. In other words, we need to have wider tentacles of information than we had before as investigative journalists.
Right.
Because if we don't do that, rogue regimes like those in Swaziland and Zimbabwe will take advantage and say, you guys, you are always, participating in misinformation. A professional journalist should not forward information whose sources have not been verified, because we use these sources for verification. So if for instance, if somebody says there is a rumor of a coup, say in Botswana, a professional journalist must not pass that news until they actually investigate themselves and see whether that is true or false.
Yes.
Just because you want your byline to be the first to appear with the news of a possible coup in Botswana does not make you a journalist. This is why African governments take advantage and say, you guys, you always pass misinformation on electoral results, on corruption and all that. And they then have these strange laws like we have in Zimbabwe, the Patriotic Act, meant to silence you.
Right.
The Crime and the Criminal Codification Act. Sometimes we bring this on ourselves. So as professional journalism bodies and as guilds and as associations and as unions, let's sit down and re-strategize. There's a new trajectory of information highway. How do we deal with it? How do we compete with the citizen journalist who is not accountable to anybody? Because as a professional journalist, I am accountable. I don't just write anything and send it to Africa Report. I discuss the concept with them. They fact check my sources, so that as soon as my byline comes out of the Africa Report, they know that this information coming from Southern Africa is correct. It doesn't matter what the citizen journalist has said. If it has been said by Rejoice Ngwenya, it is correct. That is what enhances our credibility as journalists. But we need to also be aware that we are living in a highly competitive world. When it was taking 1 week to get information from Moi, Now it takes just about 30 seconds to get information about, Kenyatta. That is what it is. So we no longer have the luxury of running back and forth upstairs, to the political editor, downstairs to the what. We don't have that, but we can be trained and skilled to fact check our information in the best way possible, so that we don't bring journalism into disrepute. The reason why African dictators, terrorize us is because they claim and allege that we pass misinformation and we forward sources that are not verified. And it is correct, because we don't have the correct training. So journalist unions and guild houses should get together and invite highly skilled individuals on fact checking, so that you can be retrained and re-equipped and re-skilled, in order that would benefit from this double sword of the information highway, which is shortening by the day. We are talking 5G now, next year to be 7G. And before you know it, everybody who's got a phone, a smartphone, is a journalist and a camera, and probably even media houses will be relying on those kind of people, and our profession will be in tatters. So we should reskill ourselves, retool ourselves, reconfigure our mentality and our predisposition towards the information highway, so that we remain competitive, factual, and so that our sources are not doubted. We don't want to invite unnecessary retribution from these dictators.
Yeah, thank you for those sentiments. I think it's a common occurrence, really. We've seen media houses, the main media houses in this country, reporting the same piece of news, but quoting different figures, statistics, and so on. And,
absolutely.
Yeah, citizens. Absolutely. We end up with so many questions, and as a by the way, do you think our investigative journalism, as a continent, has gotten better, worse, with the advancement of technology?
No, it hasn't. Unfortunately not. And we are at a time when investigative journalism should be easier because of the disposal which we have to technology.
Right.
But I know that media houses are always quick to want to be on the front page with the hottest story. But it creates problems, because investigative journalism is an element of time. You need time, and you need the necessary equipment. And these things are now available. It means that we need to reconfigure the way that we identify our sources, so that we're able to remain credible. I mean, look, if you are watching Al Jazeera and CNN of exactly the same bombing at Rahelia, refugee camp, it's like you're looking at two different countries.
Right.
Exactly. Which means even journalists of high integrity, like those we have in CNN and Al Jazeera, they are also subject. They're also competing with social media, because I can see the effects of the bombing on a social media, citizen journalist, which he has taken with his phone. I can see the size of the crater, the number of children that have been murdered, and all that. And when I'm looking at CNN, I don't see any terrorists that have been murdered by those bombs. You know what I mean? Yeah. But CNN will be saying the commander of Hamas has been killed, but we don't see him there. Yeah. And the other media is saying thousands and hundreds of children have been killed and murdered, and I can see them because I'm getting that from social networks. So you can see that even the credibility of a journalist can be eroded by a citizen journalist, because the same story, something happens at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, KTV is going to report something completely different from the independent media. Yeah. And this creates problems with credibility. So that's why it is important for us to understand the psychology behind. We should have a course, a fully fledged course on the psychology behind citizen journalism, so that we're able to take them on and compete them at their own level. And then so that we're not even be subject of the whims of our media, of our editors, because our editors can also be a problem sometimes.
Right.
So you can see that we have a big thing, we have a big issue on our hand, and we should get onto our feet, hit the ground running, because the information highway is going to get faster and faster and faster. There will be better and better smartphones with good quality. You will be able to edit the story, to put your subtitles, everything within 10, 15 minutes, you're already selling your story to a news agency. So we need to start adapting and keeping up with the pace of technological development.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Yeah, we have about 20 minutes or so to the end of this discussion, and now I was hoping now we can get into the solutions. What has to be done to increasingly protect the rights of journalists, and particularly to be able to hold accountable people who are subjecting journalists to all these kinds of suffering, and yeah, our institutions and so on. And I want to begin with these journalists, organizations and guilds and so on. What is their role in all these, and what must they do, to make sure that they set a precedence, they create that environment where everyone sees that there's a problem. There's a problem in our countries in terms of protecting journalists, and actually everyone need to begin to do something in terms of airing these issues, and we start holding people accountable.
Well, look, if I can understand your question correctly, because I've got an answer to it.
Okay.
You are saying there are media or journalist organizations that exist that have a responsibility of doing something. Is that what you're saying?
And yeah, organization and journalists will always belong to these what do they call them?
Right.
These organizations like the guilds. I know there's a guild.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Right.
Kenya,
do you know that? Yeah, that's true. I understood the question. It's important. One of the most fundamental facts that I want to say is that every professional journalist must belong to a local, a regional, and an international organization. It's a must. It's totally unacceptable for a journalist not to be a member of any organization, because they are opening themselves, they are vulnerable. And even if a government says to you are not allowed to be a member of a union, don't believe the government.
Yeah.
Tell the government that we have a constitution that allows us freedom of association. So it is the responsibility of that union or that gathering or that guilds to understand what the constitution says, because it's all political decisions have to be taken by a government to say, we want to put in ourselves in a space where we promote high quality and independent journalism. It must be a constitutional obligation. It must be in the constitution. So it is only a journalist organization that can be able to interpret the constitution to see if there are any discrepancies or any deficiencies in that constitution. Because without constitutional provisions, it doesn't matter what the independent or a guild or association can do. It's not going to work. So everything starts with the constitution. And once you are sure of the constitution, then you go to the legislative aspect, to the laws. Do the laws allow for effective investigative and independent journalism? Do they allow? If they don't allow and they are disruptive like we have in Zimbabwe, cause the politicians to change those laws. Because you, as journalists, you might not be able, but you wield a lot of power and authority to bring down a government. But instead of conflicting with the government, you need also to be able to cooperate so that your laws, the laws that protect your interests are put in place. Because if there are no laws that protect your interests, there is no guild or union that can protect you. The reason why the Hollywood Guild of Actors or Screenwriters is powerful is because there are laws that protect independence and sovereignty and freedom in states. So if the script writers in Hollywood say we are shutting down, we are not writing any script until our interests are acknowledged, that happens, things change. So in Africa, we should learn to be members of guilds, and those guilds should be skilled and given information that makes them add value to the life of journalists. They must be able to protect the rights of journalists, their constitutional rights, their human rights, and be able to intercede and intertwine with regional and continental and international organizations. So they must be members of continental and or global organizations. So they benefit from expertise and they get stronger. So this is the first point that I should point out, make with journalists. And of course, naturally, our skills and our training processes and our syllabus and curriculums should evolve. We should not allow government-run universities or whatever universities to come up with the watered-down, curriculums and syllabus that make us pliant and compliant to a government. We should look at these independent institutions of journalists should go into universities and colleges and see what the students are learning. Are these modern or precepts of journalism, or are we just breeding puppets and cronies to work in government institutions? No. We should have a say in the syllabus of a university, whether it is a master's program in media studies or whether it is electronic journalism or what, which these organizations should have a say, so that the conveyor belt of journalists should produce quality journalists that are able to be independent and run sustainable lives. And of course, finally, other than journalists that are employed formally by media houses, independent journalists should also be protected. Freelance journalists are having a problem surviving in Africa. I should survive from journalism because it is a profession.
Right.
If my colleagues who is an structural engineer or a doctor can survive by running a practice, why do I need to be employed by KBC? I can be sending news items to different news agencies. So independent journalists and freelance journalists should also be having a sub, a unit of organizational institutions within those guilds, so their interests are protected. So that roughly, to me, would be the sort of direction that a matrix or a template can follow in order to strengthen and immunize ourselves against impunity.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Rejoice, for those remarks. And yeah, maybe if I can remind our audience, just before I ask my last question, I think we have about 5 minutes or so. So if you have any questions for myself or Rejoice, please make use of the chat box, or rather section that we have here on Zoom. Just type and then I'll be able to float the same to Rejoice. And yeah, maybe just a comment. I think it's very important what you said on the curricula, and these doesn't just affect journalists in Africa. It's a lot more, professions that are still stuck with a curricula that doesn't account for most developments that we are having in this 21st century. And I think, yeah, that is something that I would read, and and the importance of journalists being involved in the process of developing the curricula and writing.
Yes, and you know what?
Yeah.
And you know what? I've got a friend who was running a big weekly financial paper. He was saying to me, we are not just no longer interested in simple guys that say, I did a course in journalism at the college or in the University of Nairobi. I've got a master's in media studies. What do you specialize in? Are you an economist? Are you a political scientist? Are you a medical guy? Are you, a philosopher? So exactly. A journalist should be a professional, a specialist area. Yes, you can't write about everything. Gone are the days of the Moi and the Jomo Kenyatta time when a journalist would comment about economics, about religion, about philosophy, about ideology. No, specialize. I am a liberal economist. So when I comment about economics, I comment effectively on free markets and global trade. Right. I'm not a religious journalist. I can write about religion, but I'm not. So journalists should learn to specialize.
Yeah, I think that's a very important thing. In terms of you gotta have you have to have some some basics of knowledge, from what you are reporting on, what you are writing on. Even when you are fact checking, it matters a lot. What information really, what what your training is, in as much as at the end of the day, you are a journalist, and we don't end up simplifying the role of a journalist as just writing articles and reporting news and so on. Yeah, so thank you so much for those comments. And yeah, let me just to my final question. Liberty Sparks, for example, in the civil society, we a free markets think tank, but here we are having a discussion on the rights of the journalists, because we understand how important they are in being able to push, for policies, for narratives, and be able to shape public opinion in terms of maybe policies that we're trying to get across and so on. So in terms of protecting rights of journalists, in terms of holding people, the gatekeepers to these institutions that matter, what is our role? What can we do, to add our voice, to try to amplify the fact that there's a problem that needs to be addressed?
That's a fantastic question, because it's a think tank, really, Liberty Sparks, or COMALISO, or Imani, or Free Market Foundation. We need to be centers of information excellence.
Right.
In other words, we are actually saying journalists, media houses should rely on our sources of information, because we have both the expertise and the skills to do a well-researched situation. So we double up as centers of information because of our term papers. Just before the national budgets, we do budget analysis and control. and evaluation, right, just before elections and so forth. So we are the sources of information, because we have got the necessary skills. After all, we are a think tank. When somebody wants to write about property rights and title deeds in Zimbabwe, they would do better by, first of all, going through our materials, because we've invested time in researching. So there's no point in reinventing the wheel. Everything that they have to know about title deeds, we have already done the work.
Right.
If it is news, it's different. So as a think tank, our responsibility is to keep on accumulating these sources, these centers of information, so that we become the credible source of investigative journalists. And of course, we should also use our networks to bring together these skills. I was telling you, we were talking about it initially, retraining journalists, right, bring together experts from CNN, from BBC, from Al Jazeera, and exposing journalists to new forms of the information highway. It is our responsibility to bring in facilitators and moderators and skilled people to uplift the skills of journalists. So we've got a very strong dual role.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah. Of course, we have even simple discussions like the one that we are having, particularly very important. Sure. Because there's a lot that we discussed today that it's not obvious to the public, to the next guy. And yeah, when like you said, we can be, when the journalist is fact checking, we can always be the source of those facts. Yeah, so thank you so much. You can see Eric has a question for you. The international laws that protect journalists, for example, African Union has laws that protect journalists. If yes, why are they? Why do they seem not to be applicable, especially in developing countries?
No, they are not. Once you start talking about regional organizations like SADC, IGAD, and so forth, even UNESCO and United Nations, they don't have laws. They have protocols and resolutions.
Right.
So until those protocols are domesticated, we say that's what we call in constitutionalism. Those protocols that are in SADC or IGAD or ECOWAS must be domesticated in local legislation. So it is the responsibility of our journalist organizations, our guilds, to cause parliamentarians and lawmakers to domesticate this. We should put pressure on government to domesticate these international protocols, right, so that when we make reference to regional protocols, we are protected by domestic laws. So any African country that is redoing its constitution on media freedom and journalism should borrow from regional and international and continental protocols so that they domesticate these protocols in local laws. But otherwise, they themselves, like AU and SADC and IGAD and ECOWAS, they don't have laws. They simply have protocols on sovereignty and media freedom. Yes.
Okay, yeah. So thank you so much. I think, Eric, I hope Rejoice understood and really responded to what you wanted to ask. And yeah, that's the challenge. Most of these are what do we call them, supranational organizations. Right? They really don't have laws or the capacities to be able to enforce these laws in particular countries. And what they usually have is those are resolutions and protocols. What they are saying is that they are just pointing you to the direction that your country should be heading.
True.
Laws and so on. Yeah, so thank you so much, Rejoice from COMALISO, as always, for joining us for this session.
Absolutely.
It is the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, and really, we're just looking at the importance of protecting, rather creating a safe and an enabling environment for journalists to be able to carry their work without fear, irrespective of which country they're operating from. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. As usual, we are going to be having this video recording going up on our YouTube channel at Liberty Sparks. And yeah, we hope that if there's something you really want to check, you can be able to do that and share with your friends. So thank you so much for joining us, and good night, everyone. See you during our next session.